Hello and welcome back to Cherie and Elizabeth Talk Sports. We're here for another week of video updates talking about women in sports media. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of Strides Forward, and I am here with Elizabeth Emery, who is the host and producer of Hear Her Sports podcast. And let's just check in with you, Elizabeth. How are things going?
Sure. It's really good. I love being in sort of off season. We've talked about how, skiing is my thing now. And so summer is off season. But what my news for today is that I was preparing for an upcoming episode. It's going to be another one on lightweight rowing. I'm so fascinated by this topic and sort of discussing more and more because I don't know if everybody knows it, but they are thinking about uh, after Paris Olympics getting rid of the sport as an Olympic sport. And there's all these different changes and discussions about the sport. So I'm totally fascinated. So I was getting ready and I watched a video webinar put on by Rowing Ireland. And Rowing Ireland uh, is the national governing body of Ireland, and I spoke to Afri Keogh in the podcast, and so I sort of keyed into them. They definitely know what they're doing. And this webinar was on energy availability. We've talked about that a lot, about REDS, and it was just so great. I mean, such good information. And my personal takeaway was, yes, for menopause, perimenopause women, older women, protein is so important. It is so, so important. However, we cannot forget about carbohydrates because
Right.
carbohydrates are what actually is the fuel. So I think I was starting to forget about how important carbohydrates are, since I'm active and I'm an endurance athlete and I haven't cut back completely like Stacy Sims suggests, like to really cut back on hours. So I'm still doing a decent number of hours of exercise. So I do need my carbohydrates, and I definitely notice when I'm not getting them. Just
Uh-huh.
small little things. But anyway, so that was pretty great.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing I wanted to ask is you mentioned something about the IOC cutting out the sport, and but you mean just lightweight rowing
Lightweight rowing,
from
correct?
okay, yeah, yeah. That's what I thought. I just wanted
Yeah, not rowing in
ask that
general.
question. I was like,
Yeah,
wait a
yeah.
minute, did I miss something?
No, and just as
Yeah.
a update, I mean, the most recent episode of Hear Her Sports is with Michelle Sexer, who is an American lightweight rower. She went to the Olympics last time uh, as in the double sculls, lightweight double sculls, and that's the only lightweight event in the Olympics is this double sculls. And she and I had a
Okay.
great conversation about what's great about the sport, but also the problems with the sport. And sort of, she really got into the intrinsic problem with the sport of having, high level competitive athletes trying to reduce their weight.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And all the problems that come with that.
correct.
So, yeah, yeah. Well, on my mind this week, I've also been thinking about something having to do with producing my podcast, and that is women in the history of sport. Uh, my my production has to do with doing an episode about Bobby Gibb, and she was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon before women were allowed to run the Boston Marathon. That was 1966 that she ran. And of course, this year is marking the 50th anniversary of women officially being allowed to run in the Boston Marathon because that happened in 1972. And it's just got me thinking a lot about the importance of appreciating the women who came before. And I I love the history. I love the stories, but I'm also so taken with the bravery of these women and also like I'm so fascinated by what compelled them to go out and do these things. Like what why go against the grain?
Mm,
Why do there are stories about women literally getting tackled on running courses because they were running with men and they, technically weren't supposed to be there, but they were basically they were protesting. And I feel like it's so important for us to remember what came before us and that if it weren't for these women, like where would we be? And the fact that I can just sign up for any running race these days and to think about that I can meet women today who grew up and they could not, that just blows my mind.
I know. I
So,
totally get it.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I know you think about this a lot too, Elizabeth. So I want to hear your
I
thoughts.
do. I think a lot about it because I, like you, think that the history of women's sports is so important. And I sometimes get that like old lady thing, like, why, she's just a grumpy old lady. And why is she worried about the history? We've moved on, blah, blah, blah. But one of the things is that I think it's important for us to remember what we went through in the past, in part so people can't say, naysayers can't say, oh, well, you've never asked for blah, blah, blah. And you can say,
Right.
yes, this is the story of so and so asking for that thing.
Yeah.
And then here's
Yeah.
another story of somebody else asking for it again later. But I think that knowledge gives us power, and uh, we're not susceptible to being duped in a way, knowing the stories of the women that came before us.
Yeah, and the other thing I think about a lot too is that it's important to have those stories out there to establish the fact that women have been athletes for a really long time. Just
Yes,
nobody's been talking about it.
right.
And it's been brushed under the rug a lot. And, the our statistic we always come back to is like only 4% of sports media is covering women, mainstream sports media, of course. And how small that would have been back before women could do
Oh my
even certain
goodness.
types of events. Like it just didn't exist, right? Like people
Yeah,
weren't really covering it. Although I will say that Bobby Gibb got a lot of attention when she ran the Boston Marathon. It became international news, which is pretty amazing to think about. Like
it's
that it
cool.
spread over the wire. So yeah, her story is just fascinating.
Well, the
Uh,
other thing that it does is it counters false stories,
yes.
which I just thought of. Yeah. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the false stories that I was reminded about recently was that they had held the 800-meter for women at the Olympics. The first time they did it, the media came out and said that the women collapsed. We
I
can't do
know.
this
Ugh.
anymore. And the media spread what was a lie because it
Fake
did not
news.
happen. It was fake news,
Yeah.
the original fake news, women
Right.
collapsing at the finish line of the 800-meter. And
Right.
but it went out as real news and it had real consequences and it put
Significant
women back.
consequences. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so I think it is important to get the stories right. And even though we're sort of way past that, there are still myths that hold on, like it's going to hurt your reproductive system to be an athlete as a woman. I
That's
mean,
that's one of my points from the articles that we're going to be discussing later. Is like
yes,
how long these myths. Oh my goodness!
I
Like
know.
seriously, the 70s and 80s, people still thought uteri were going to fall out.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah,
insane. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I hear you. So, oh, let's laugh.
Yes.
Um, So moving on, we always like to highlight an episode from one of our podcasts, and I'm going to highlight my very first episode that I ever put out on Strides Forward was about the ultra runner Devin Yanko. And I should say she's a marathon runner and an ultra runner because she does road marathons and has qualified for a few times for the Olympic trials, which is no small feat to be a competitive road marathoner and then also to be really one of the best ultra marathoners. And I picked this episode. The episode was about her running Comrades, which it is one of her favorite races. And she has lived in Cape Town, and so it's very dear to her heart to go run over in South Africa. And I will first ask you about your impression of the episode, Elizabeth, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why I am so excited to talk about Devin Yanko this week.
Sure. So what I took from the episode, and I did re-listen to it. I had listened to it, although I hadn't realized it was your first episode, so that's
Yeah.
pretty exciting. But what I got me thinking was how she was talking about when you're thinking about the future during your efforts and
Mm,
not sort of getting yourself caught up in um, what's going to happen. Just stay in the moment. And I
yeah.
really really like that. I think like it's so easy for us to get I, I don't know, lost in things that might happen later and not be really focused on the effort that you're putting in at the moment. So that was what I took from that.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a hard thing to do when you're running really, really far, like
A
Devin does.
long time. Yeah.
Because a lot of things can go wrong and when you're not feeling well. and say you're in a 100-mile race and you're at mile 50 and things are not going particularly well, it's hard to not catastrophize that, like, if I feel this bad now,
Yeah.
I mean, what's going to happen in
Yeah.
2 hours?
Well, that's what they talk about. All those ultras are such a mental game.
Mhm. Well, so the reason I'm so excited to talk about Devin Yanko this week is that she ran a 100 miler this last weekend, the Umstead 100, and she absolutely crushed it. And Devin has had these periods of going through injuries and having some health issues along her career. Uh, and then she comes out with these performances that are just absolutely epic. And I got to watch her do that on Saturday. And she absolutely, not only did she PR at 39 years old in the 100
Wow.
mile, but she also won the race outright. She's the first woman in the history of that race. It's been going on for almost 30 years. So she won by almost an hour and a half. She took over, I believe it was over a half hour off the women's course record. But even beyond all of that, which is just absolutely incredible, all of those, all of those realities, even beyond that, it's a loop course, so you get to see the runners coming and going. And I was out on the race course as well. I was helping pace my husband, I was crewing, so I was seeing Devin. I probably saw her about 10 times throughout the day. She was on fire. Like, undoubtedly, she was just taking that race by storm. I
Wow.
never saw her. There wasn't a moment where she wasn't smiling, where she wasn't looking super duper strong. It was just a master class in running incredibly well from start to finish. It was just something to behold. And I don't know, it was just so exciting. And in the episode that I had highlighted for us to highlight today, she talks about how she has these Devon days
I was
that
just
she
thinking the
calls them.
same. Yeah,
And
it's
so I'm just
awesome.
like, she had her Devon day,
Yeah,
and it was just brilliant. I really hope she gets the media attention that a performance like that deserves, because it was really incredible.
you know
So,
what? You're reminding me. One of the things I really like about sports is that even people who can't, like that aren't really into that sport, can tell excellence. And
mhm.
it's fascinating to me that you were able to tell how excellent she was doing. I mean, yeah, you were there and ultra running and you were helping, but there's something that happens to a person when they're having a Devon day,
Yeah,
which is
yeah, and
visible.
it was really clear. And you don't want to, like, 50 miles into the race or whatever, I didn't want to be like, yeah, she's definitely on it. Like, you don't know what's going on with somebody,
Yeah,
but man, you could see it. And like, it gives me goosebumps. Like, you could just see it going and going and going. And man, it was just cool to watch.
that's
And she
great.
was calm the whole day. I mean, it was really cool.
Did you see
So
her at any of the stations, the aid stations?
Oh yeah. Yeah, her, like,
So,
she was getting her stuff right, like, across the path from where I was waiting for
oh,
my
okay.
runner. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I'm
So,
always interested in how people manage that because you can see, like we've watched a lot of those movies about ultra runners, and you can see when things are going bad.
well,
Like
that's
they're a
exactly.
mess at
Yeah.
the aid station.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I was like 10 feet away from her when she was doing her exchanges with her pit crew, basically. And she was calm. She knew what she wanted. If there was something that she wanted to change that was not the plan she had given them, she was just so, calm and happy and thankful, and off she went,
Cool. Yeah,
yeah,
cool.
it was really very cool. And the other thing, and I've mentioned this about the ultra scene before, but what I find interesting is that, Devin was leading. I want to say she took the lead about halfway through. And, obviously, like, there was no question. I mean, with, I believe, even maybe even 3 laps to go, and there were about 12-mile loops. I think she had like an hour on second place. So it was really clear that she was, on to something great. And nowhere in the murmurings of all the people standing around did I hear anything along the lines of, like, oh, it's a girl who's going to beat everybody, or oh my gosh, it's a woman. Like, there was just total respect for, this is an awesome runner and she's going to take this thing. And there wasn't that like super surprise of like, oh, the guys are getting beaten by a woman, or there was absolutely none of that. And it's one of the things I love about that sport because, that happens.
Yeah.
And it's like, let's just appreciate it for the athleticism it is,
Yeah.
and nor was there any belly aching by, any of the men. Obviously, they all had incredible respect for this person, this
Yeah.
human being doing this amazing thing. So I also appreciate that. And I will say that the race director is a woman, and she was very,
Oh,
very
nice.
touched by, having Devin there and having a woman win the race. So yeah, we were all very excited. It was very cool.
Cool.
So
I
yeah,
love it.
yeah. So moving on, speaking about cool things that are going on with women in sports, I want to talk about this week the Spanish women's soccer, or football, as we may go back and forth a little bit since we're Americans, but they're European and they call it football, we call it soccer. Uh, but talking about what's going on in Spain with women's football. Uh, and the short part of it is that it is on fire and they are doing incredible things. And what kicked off my re-interest in what was going on with Spanish football for women was the record number of attendees that a recent game had. It was over 90,000 people packed a stadium to watch. I swear I
And
was
it's
going to get
and
me
it's
choked up.
it's sold out in like 3 days or something.
Yes,
It
you
was
could not get
crazy.
tickets.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Elizabeth, because I've been
Okay.
talking for a long time here. So what's on your mind about this whole situation?
What struck me most, and this is not going to be foreign from what I talk about a lot, was a quote, and I'm going to read it. There was a
Sure.
mindset change 7 years ago. The club was not building a women's football project, but a professional football project in women's football to invest in the same way to build the same project. And this to me is the crux of everything. It's so important. Like just throwing junkiness to women's sports is never going to do it. It does. It has to be that mindset change, and you have to have the people who want to accept that mindset change at the club, at the organization, because otherwise it's not going to happen. And there was one article that you pointed out where they talked about another club that didn't want to make the change, and the guy was saying like it's not worth it for us to try to get them to have a women's team because they're never going to invest in it, they're never going to have the heart in it. So that's what I think is so impressive about this whole story about FC Barcelona, is that they understood that the mindset came first. And what that resulted in was a complete change up of the organization. And, they invested money, but they also had trainers, they had nutritionists, they started collecting data, they had a whole scouting team, sports science. It just, because they have this mindset, everything else happens. And so that's what struck me.
Yeah, and so just to go back a little bit is that the sort of the organization called La Liga that oversees the men's side of the league decided to really invest in the women's side of football in Spain in 2015. And they were incredibly smart. They said, we want to build a fan base. We want to make women's soccer attractive, and we know how to do it because everybody here loves soccer. It's a huge sport in that country, and we're going to do what we did for the men, for the women. And it was across the board. It was
Right.
promotions, it was more television coverage, it was all those, like, they expanded the team behind the team.
Right.
They had, the women had all the support. They were talking about things like, addressing pregnancy and making, professionalizing the sport. That was one of the big things that I kept seeing come up again and again and again. And it's like, we want to professionalize the sport and promote the sport. And one of the things that I did think was interesting, it's a quote that I'm going to read from, it's the La Liga newsletter. And it's a quote from Pedro Malabia, and he is the head of the women's side of things for La Liga. And from everything I've read, this man has done an incredible job. And I'm also going to add in here that it's not as much as we need to empower women to be behind the scenes, and that was acknowledged in some of what I read too. The men were on board. The
Yeah.
men, there are men who are behind the scenes in managerial positions, in power positions, in the women's soccer, on the women's soccer side of things, and they sound so passionate about making this a success and really invested in it.
It's so
Um,
cute. Before you read that, it's so
yeah,
curious to me. I mean, going back to the mindset thing, like how do you get or how like who was it that got everybody on board? Because, not everybody is naturally going to be on board. I mean, it really is exceptional that they were able to do that.
I agree with you. And, and it was interesting because, along in my reading, I remember there was one bit about how they have these younger girls teams that are playing the boys teams and crushing it,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
beating the boys like pretty soundly, and these girls are very very good soccer players. And it was saying that it doesn't come without comment. The parents won't admit that the girls are just better players. They tell the boys like, you didn't do this enough, you didn't do that enough, when in fact it's just that these girls beat you at this
Right.
game because they're really 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 good.
Right.
So, and
Yeah.
not that I have an interest in making this a boys versus girls or men versus women. But there's respect to be had too. And it's just like, well, let's start respecting these women for how
Yeah.
well they play.
Yeah.
So anyways, going back to the quote that I was going to read, because I do like the fact that Pedro Malabia pointed this out, is he was quoted as saying in this La Liga newsletter, women's football is something different. It will be important to find the right balance between investment and having financial resources, which women's football absolutely needs in order to grow, while paying lots of attention for caring for the product. And I just thought it's so nice to hear somebody acknowledge that this is a different situation. And he does go on to talk about how, in addition to competition, I'm quoting again, we are talking about a project that transmits values and messages that are very important for the development of our society.
Mm.
Which, like, that makes, again, like, it just stuff just gets me really choked up, I gotta say. Um, because part of what's driving this in Spain too is feminism,
Mm.
is the fact that women are speaking out in across the board. And I've talked to some friends who are Spanish, who live in Spain and live in Barcelona, and it's a very big push these days. The whole machismo thing, people are getting fed up with. And I will say, when you said like who's driving this change, there was even a quote from their prime minister that we need to have the days of women being athletes, being heroes behind us.
Wow.
Like, this needs to be our norm. And I just kept reading that more and more. So it just fascinates me. And they're just doing a hell of a job.
They're doing a hell of a job, and I think what excites me about this is how smart it is. It just, you know, and maybe that's why you're getting choked up too. It's just like they've totally embraced it. It's being done with such intelligence, and they seem to understand all the issues that we talk about all the time. Like,
Right.
they want the women not to have a second job, for example, which, like
Yes.
how often are the men's organizations saying that? And then even that they're thinking about media coverage, and one of the things articles said that they got a sky cam, so they're not just thinking about like I hope somebody else covers it, but they're making, again, going back to what you said, they're making the product be really great, and to do that you need good camera work and all this stuff. It just seems like they're getting it from all angles. They totally understand what's going on and are willing to put the time and effort into it.
Yeah, and what I thought was another interesting part of this whole project was the way that they're investing in youth.
Mm.
They're very committed to bringing up younger players, and they opened up, I guess there's this famous school that young athletes can go to, and they just opened it up to girls last year. So now these girls can come and train sort of as professional athletes, really,
Yeah.
from a very
Yeah.
young age. And yeah, yeah, they were also like, they do have recruitment, but they're also recruiting from within, and it's very important for them to build up these athletes from a young age and be able to have their own farm teams,
Right.
basically. So yeah, it's just a whole package, and it's working. I mean, it's just, if you invest,
Yeah.
here you go. And I won't read the quote, but along the way, and not surprisingly, like you said, it's just all these things that we've been talking about. They said, it's not that the interest isn't there. If you invest and you make these women visible, the audience is already there for you. You
Right.
just have to like make the connections.
Right.
Um, so yeah, and one exciting thing that I did see that I did see in there is that so officially women's soccer has been acknowledged by the government as a professional sport. Uh, and I don't understand all the ins and outs of how that works, but it's a big deal because the only other sports that are recognized as professional by the government are men's soccer and basketball.
Hmm.
So this was a big deal, and it is meant to open up channels of more sponsorship and more support. And one of the things I read that is that they landed a $10 million sponsorship very recently, like at the beginning of, I think it was this month maybe, for the women's new professional women's soccer league.
Yeah.
So they already have a title sponsor, which
It's
is
great. It's great. Yeah.
so
I'm sort of speechless because I keep on thinking like they kept on comparing it to the women, the American women, and it sort of seems like America's antiquated now,
you
in
know
comparison.
I've got to say, I feel the same way. And I think one of the big differences that I notice, and I do not know all the ins and outs of American soccer, and I don't even want to speak to that at all. But one of the big differences is that Spanish people are huge soccer fans already.
Sure,
So they
sure,
have that template. And so, they have their fan base, and now they just need to show that, oh, we have these incredible women, and they've already done that, right? I mean,
right.
and they're selling out stadiums. So this was not a one-off either. And I think it might be interesting if one wanted to go look at what like a regular game. This was a very big special game
Yeah, yeah,
between two historic rivals, Madrid and Barcelona. So it was a very big deal. But there were other occasions where there were tens of thousands of fans, and in stadiums that weren't even near this one. There was a huge crowd. I think it was over 60,000 people in Bilbao, which is quite a ways away from Barcelona.
right,
Uh, so it just goes to show, I think, that there are, sort of fans everywhere. and
right,
and one other thing that I thought was really nice, again bringing in the men, is that the men's teams were promoting their companion women's teams through their social media in really genuine ways, and
right.
it made a difference.
Right. Well, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're a fan of the man's soccer, I mean, you must be, they don't play all the time. So you must really want to watch games. And look, now there's a women's team for your same club. And yay. So you can watch that now too.
Right. And one of the things they pointed out is it's like people just like to watch good soccer.
Right. Exactly.
It's just that simple.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, Elizabeth, I don't have anything else to say without, breaking down and crying. So no
Yes.
one wants that.
No one wants that. We could do that probably every episode.
We could, for crying for one reason or another,
Yeah,
happy tears or sad. Who
exactly.
knows? Well, I
Well,
think that does it for us this week.
great.
Yeah. So I'm going to sign off for both of us. I am Cherie Turner of Strides Forward Podcast, here with,
Elizabeth Emery from Hear Her Sports podcast. Talk to you later.
talk to you next week. Bye bye.